Howdy and welcome back to the workshop. In today's episode, we're going to be digging into my all-time second favorite subject. First, it's Jesus, then it's power hammers. And so we're going to be digging into the power hammer right here, the Beaudry number 11 400-pound mechanical forging hammer, because I've been using it for about a year now, and it's got a few issues.
Today's episode is sponsored by HelloFresh. HelloFresh is a meal subscription service. They have 35 different meals per week that you can choose from. If you want to be carb smart, calorie smart, pescatarian, whatever you want, they can tailor it to your dietary needs or preferences. They send you fresh, never frozen ingredients right to your door, and then you follow along with the recipe, and you're able to cook awesome, delicious, fresh meals in a very simple, convenient way. It's cheaper than getting takeout. You build cooking skills, which is cool. It saves you a trip to the grocery store. Isaiah and I just had a delicious lunch of bulgogi meatballs where we got to chop up the scallions, chop up the ginger, throw it all together, make some rice, make the meatballs, make the green beans, and it turned out to be just a delicious and convenient and fast lunch. It took about 15 minutes, so it was fast and convenient. I really enjoyed it. Go to HelloFresh.com and use code WillStelter21 at checkout for 21 free meals, plus free shipping. That's a good deals for some good meals. So thank you a ton to HelloFresh for sponsoring today's episode. I hope you guys check them out. With that, let's segue back in to the video.
So here's the deal. This hammer is probably the coolest thing in this workshop, maybe in the whole world. It was built in January of 1924. It was the first hammer that Beaudry & Company of Boston, Massachusetts produced in 1924, which means that it is 99 years old. Beaudrys are kind of thought of as being the Cadillacs of mechanical forging hammers. I'd say that these are the best versatile forging hammers. Unfortunately, people knew that 99 years ago as well, and so this guy has been used pretty hard, and that has created a few issues that we're going to address here in this episode. Now, the first two issues that we're going to talk about are down here. They're a little bit more accessible than the third issue. Hello, Marty. The first thing is an issue that has just very recently presented itself, and that issue is that this piece right here, this piece of all thread with a nut on it, is not supposed to be in my hand. It is supposed to be right here, holding down the anvil of the power hammer. You see, this anvil right here is separate from the main frame of the power hammer. And so that means that as the ram travels down and hits the lower die, preferably with something down in there between it, the shock is not going into the frame of the hammer. It's being transferred into the 5 inches of wood and 40 inches of concrete underneath everything. And so it isolates the stress that is put into the anvil from the frame itself, which ideally leads to more longevity in the life of the hammer. Unfortunately, I was recently forging out this hot cut tool right here for my giant anvil, and I had this tool right here, which slips down through the hole in the casting and allows me to tighten down my bolts on the anvil. And while I was forging, this thing just kind of fell off. It was on this bolt over here, which is where this one's supposed to go. Just kind of fell off. I didn't really think anything of it. But I noticed that my anvil was getting a little bit bouncier, and I was like, oh, well, you know, better tighten down those bolts again. The thing is, because this is fresh wood that I used underneath the hammer, it's continually compressing as I use it. And so as I use it, I have to tighten down the bolts to keep them tight, and that anvil just kind of sinks down lower and lower until eventually it'll find its natural settling point, and then it'll kind of stick there. I don't quite know how, but I guess my anvil got just loose enough to be able to put pressure and actually snap this piece of grade 5 all thread just in half. I naturally would assume that it would have stripped the threadings before breaking the bolt itself, and it snapped inside of the nut. So that's something we're gonna have to address, figuring out how to hold down the anvil on that part. I kind of have an idea. It's going to involve the lathe and building an interesting little system. The second problem also involves the anvil, and that is you see that there's a gap here between the anvil and the frame of the hammer. This design of power hammer was produced for about 60 years or so, from the 1890s up until about the 40s, maybe the 50s. I don't quite know when they stopped production. They went through several different foundries that were casting the frames and the anvils of the hammer, and on almost every hammer that I've seen, there's a different gap between the frame of the hammer here and the anvil itself. And so some of those have a wide enough gap where driving wooden wedges around to be able to center that anvil and make sure that these dies are lined up is really easy, because you have a 1/2 inch or 3/4 of an inch to be able to drive those wedges around. Some of them, the anvil is like really tight into the frame of the hammer, and so you almost don't need that. It just kind of moves around just a hair. This hammer is at the absolute weirdest place that it could be. I have about 3/8 of an inch of gap all the way around, and that is a real problem because this anvil weighs like 1,500 or 2,000 pounds, somewhere in there, and driving around a little 3/8 inch thick wooden wedge just isn't enough to move it, and those wedges kept on coming out. I probably didn't have enough of them when I started originally. Unfortunately, there's another way to be able to separate that out and keep this anvil centered in the hammer, and that way is with a rolled ring. My friend Steve Howell, Ballard Forge, big Beaudry fanatic, loves his Beaudrys, rolled me up this ring out of T-iron to the 19.5 inch diameter that the anvil is, and so what I need to do now is cut and make a mounting system as well as line this, because I don't want steel on steel on steel. That's a good recipe to break the casting. That's probably the most common broken part I see on a Beaudry is a crack in the casting around the frame, around the anvil. And so I want to avoid that, but I also want to make sure that this anvil isn't floating around willy-nilly, because what happens when it floats around is my dies can get to an angle, my dies can walk back and forth like this, and I want to keep that tight. So right now, this side of the die is a little bit closer together than this side of the die is, and that comes partially from me not having this spaced out properly. It also means that my dies are currently crooked a little bit, and I have a way to fix that as well. That involves basically relining it up before I tighten down that bolt. Before we do that, let's talk about that third issue with the hammer, which is actually the biggest issue. Actually, there's 4 issues, because I need to fix this oiler because it's just a little bit loose on there, and occasionally it'll flip over and dump oil everywhere. But the real big issue is that in order for this hammer to run properly and to run smoothly, everything here needs to be square, and all of that is dependent on the shaft that runs from this crank disc right here through the main bearing in the top of the hammer, and then is secured to the main flywheel back here. All of that needs to be square, and the way that everything is kept square is by this main bearing right here. So inside this big old round casting right here, there is a bronze bearing, and inside that bronze bearing rides the shaft that is connected to this big old thick crank disc back here and to this main flywheel back here. This flywheel weighs 560 pounds. That's a lot. So what has happened in the last 100 years of this hammer being used is that this big old flywheel back here has sunk down inside that bearing. So rather than everything being square and primo, it's sunk down and it's wallowed out the back. And that's not good, because when that is wallowed out, it means that it sinks down. It means that the flywheel is binding at the top here. It means that everything in here is binding, which means that I need way more power to get this thing going than I should require. So right now I have a 10 horsepower, 1155 RPM motor with a tight tension pulley going to a 435 pound flywheel, which comes across to this flywheel right here, which comes down to the main pulley. And I have to have everything dead nuts, primo, exact right tension to get this hammer to run decent. And the simple fact of the matter is that this much inertial mass with that much horsepower behind it, this hammer should be screaming. I should be able to, with the brake, right now there's the brake pushing on this wheel, so I'm not gonna be able to spin it by hand, but I should be able to spin this thing by hand fairly easily. Because it's weighted in such a way, it's counterweighted to make it so that this flywheel offsets the 600 or 700 pounds that's hanging off the front right here, and it should have a good enough bearing surface that I can just move that around by hand. I can do it on Salem Straub's 300 pound hammer, so it shouldn't be too big of a deal to do it on a 400 pound hammer, perhaps a bit harder. But if you try to move this thing by hand right now, good luck. You'd have to be as strong as Rick Hall to be able to do something like that. First thing we're gonna do is pull off all this linkage here, the belt, the arm, the oiler, pull off the linkage from the front. We're gonna pull off everything here, get this wheel down to the ground. We're gonna try and take out the bronze bearing inside there, and we're gonna have to make a new one. I don't think we're gonna get to that in today's episode because I need to find out the right size of bronze and all of that good stuff. So with that, let's jump on into a little bit of disassembly. And now, should be able to pull out the pin. Okay. Bam! This is slippery. Wow, everything is so oily up here. Oh my gosh. These hammers have to be super oily, otherwise they get mad at you. Next thing's next, we're going to take off the brake here. The brake is what happens when you step down on the treadle. It lets off, and when you let off the treadle, the brake pushes back in up into the flywheel to stop it from moving, and it gives you a lot more control, which is very nice. So what we're going to do is take out this pin right here, which will release it from this arm. We're going to take off this arm, and then we're going to, on the other side here, there's a nut. We're going to take off that nut, and we're going to pull out the whole brake assembly, and we won't have to worry about breaking it when we pop off this main flywheel. Cotter pin out. Now we can pop this fella out. Look at that. It was already loose. That's not good. Ooh. Okay, so what we have here is 3 separate pieces. We have the pulley, we have the shaft that goes through the bearing of the hammer, and we have this key thing. Now, I'm a little bit encouraged because I don't think this pulley is going to be as hard to get off as I initially thought it was going to be, because I see there's some grease kind of seeping out from between where the pulley sits and the shaft. So that means that it's not completely frozen on there. So there's a few different ways that we can try and get this out. Obviously, this needs to come out first, and then we can try and pull that pulley off. What I'm going to try first is just driving a little wedge in there and seeing if it comes out. If it does, great. If not, I have an idea for a little key puller that I can make. That was a pretty obtuse wedge, but I think that our safest bet is to make that pulley puller. So here's how this nifty little device works. This right here has the slot carved in it, obviously slides in there, and now we can use the mechanical pressure from these screws. This will allow us to pull that key out. Yeah, I'm pretty confident that the screws were not the issue with this design. We have key puller V2. Extreme levels of beef on this dude. Let's go ahead and get it started. No, are you kidding me? Well, I hope you like failure because you'll love my new beefy key puller. All it did was just start to rip out that webbing that went underneath the key. There is another way to be able to get access to the key. Basically, what I'll do is take a big old piece of round stock, I'll chuck it up in my lathe, I'll drill a big hole down the middle of it, and then I'll part it off on the lathe, and that's gonna be the hammer part of the slide hammer that we're gonna build. Now, a slide hammer kind of lives up to its name. It's like a slide whistle, but hammer version. We'll then take a big piece of rod, we will weld that onto the key itself, probably with a little bit of preheat first, and then we'll weld a flange onto the end of it also so that that hammer has somewhere to stop. Now what this does is it means that you can hammer on something that you can't hammer on the end of it, but it means you can basically pull the key out by hammering. And I think I'm probably gonna have to use a little bit of heat on there in order to loosen everything up. Heat makes things expand, which makes things loosen. And I'm guessing based off of the fact that that thing didn't move at all with my last key puller, that's probably frozen in there pretty good. So a little bit of heat should help break any rust bonds that have formed. This hammer did live on the coast, so it having a little bit of rust is not terribly surprising. Well, it appears to me that our slide hammer worked quite well. It's funny because this took less time than either of the other things that I tried. The downside is that now I have to clean up this key and grind it and make it look original again, basically, when I drive it back in. You can totally see the separation line between where the pulley was sitting on it and where it was sitting on the shaft. So now all we gotta do is get the pulley off of there. Now the next step is to build a pulley puller in order to pull the pulley off of the shaft of the hammer. Now a pulley puller is basically a giant C shape. It's got 2 little arms that come over and hold the edge of the pulley, and then you weld a a nut into the middle of it that you thread a piece of all thread through, and you can put mechanical screw pressure onto the shaft that you're pulling the pulley off of. It's basically a very controllable, very strong way to pull a pulley off of something. We're going to sling it up and let it fall into the gentle swinging arms of my gantry crane. All right, we have the main flywheel off, but now we need to get the shaft and this crank plate out. Now, there's a hole that runs from right here all the way through to right there. I'm going to drop through this eye bolt, like that, and then another 1/2x13 bolt with some washers on it, and I'll be able to pick it off of that point, and that will make me a lot more comfortable with this grab. Oh, cash money! All right, well, I built a bearing pusher. It's very similar to a pulley puller, but rather than pulling pulleys, it pushes bearings. I didn't go into great depth about the build because it was almost the exact same as what I did for the pulley puller. We've got our C-frame here, and then in order to push out the bearing itself, because obviously this 1.5" all thread ain't gonna cut it, I took some micarta that fits right in there. And then the 1.5" all thread goes through the middle of that. And so I turned up a little cupping tool that will not only keep the all thread centered, but it'll spread out the force on the bearing a little bit more evenly. It's still smoking hot off the lathe though. So we're gonna try this without heating it first. And hopefully this bearing just pops out. But when it doesn't, we'll heat it up. I think that my micarta is going to break before the bearing wants to move, which is good because that's the most replaceable or easy. So that arm flexed out rather than pulling. Add a brace that will go across the top there from side to side to keep it from being able to do that. Oh, it's not moving yet. Oh, I am seeing some grease squeeze out of the top of the bearing though. That's interesting. Oh, come on! Something's breaking. And it's not the bearing moving. Shoot. This right here is breaking. That's not good. We need to take it off and reinforce these even more. Well, we let that beefy, now beefy, formerly skinny, now beefy bearing pusher, let's start getting this casting heated up. I think it is gonna need the heat. And as I'm up here, I realize that there is a large amount of grease that we're gonna have to clean off before we start burning anything. Otherwise, I'm gonna smoke out my whole shop. Boy, that sure is some crunchy grease. All right, I've got my little heat gun here. I'm gonna try and get this thing about 400, 450 degrees or so. Something I need to be cognizant of is that this wheel up here is coated in rubber. And I very much do not want to melt that rubber because I'm a little bit weird and I just don't love the smell of burning rubber. Good Lord. Well, I ran out of oxygen. Not the kind that I breathe, the kind that I use to heat things. I have a feeling that I might be able to find a weed burner either at Ace Hardware or Harbor Freight. So I'm gonna run down, see if I can find something that'll use propane to heat that up, and then we'll get on our merry way. Let's see how that works. Is that putting out too much heat? Okay. Y'all, the oil or the grease that was in there is like bubbling up out of the bottom. There's like a little oil reservoir inside there. I think that there's a hollow area inside, in between the bearing and the frame somewhere in there. We'll see when we pull it out. But all of that oil is heating up and like boiling over. That's wild. That is a big old
Nothing so far. Something's bending. Well, we just went out and I spent $400 on materials to build a new pulley puller and some dry ice to be able to shrink the bearing. And we came back and I had left it under tension, hoping that maybe it would move. And we came back and it had moved about 1/8 of an inch. And then I cranked on it a little bit more and it kept on moving. So I think we're in luck. And we were able to push this sucker out just like it is using this big wrench. Oh my gosh. Anyone need some chocolate syrup for their ice cream or power hammer? Voila! Easy. Easy day. Oh. Do you find yourself in the position, like millions of other Americans, out on the town without a convenient and stylish way to carry your normal everyday carry tools, like your flat bit tongs, your favorite Jake Ferrum forging hammer, or your favorite small hammer drift? Well, say hello to the everyday carry bearing. Always have your bearings in a stylish way with this nifty gadget. Now that we've got the bearing out of there, I can go ahead and order the new chunk of bronze. It's going to be 5.5 outside diameter, 4.5 inside diameter, but it's cast oversized 932, which is really similar to SAE 660 bearing bronze. So it should be relatively easy to machine, and it's cast oversized by like 50 thou or so. So just the right size to be able to shrink fit and interference fit up into the main casting up there. I'm still not quite sure if I'm going to be able to do that here at my own shop or if I'm going to have to go to a friend's shop to be able to do it. But if y'all stay tuned, you'll be able to follow along with that. Before we end it though, go ahead and drop a comment down below guessing how much you think this thing weighs. The first person to guess it correctly will get like an inch slice off the end of the bearing once I'm all done with it. You'll be able to cut it down, make it into guard material, or just have a neat little piece of bearing. I don't know. Another quick reminder, when we hit 250,000 subscribers, I'm going to be giving away a Damascus chef's knife. That's my specialty, my favorite thing to make. And so I'm excited to be able to give away one of those to one of you lucky folks. So spread the word, let people know, or don't, or do. Thank you to the patrons for giving us their patronage. And I will see you guys on the next one where hopefully we're going to be digging in to getting this bearing redone so I can keep on hammering things, because that's important for a blacksmith shop.